This adventure really began when Peter Dunham was returning from Sydney after his annual leave. He was fortunate to be able to pick up a foal boat, which he strapped on the back of his motorbike outfit so that he could bring it back to the Territory. He headed west, passing some beautiful streams, over the Blue Mountains via Jenolan Caves, and stayed off at the Lachlan River, very close to where he was born, at a little town called Woodstock. It was a pleasant trip, and he enjoyed every moment going back. Getting towards Hay in western New South Wales, he was unaware, of course, that a cyclone had crossed the coast of the Gulf of Carpentaria and was creating havoc in inland Australia. The Sturt Highway west of Hay was one of the victims of this rain. At Port Augusta, he was held up because there had been no trains running for several weeks, but he was fortunate to catch the first one north. The journey took 5 long days, passing so much water that it was unbelievable. He waited a day so that the water would fall below a safe level. Even then, it was 6 inches above the rails as the steam train crossed the Fink River. Alice Springs was a garden, so different from when he had travelled down in early December. It was a pleasant trip north, but many of the creeks, Attack Creek, Wycliffe Well, were still flowing very strongly, weeks and weeks after the original rain. He decided to try the canoe out on the Roper River after rebuilding the skin, which had perished and was cracked from lack of use. The new skin was made of 5 layers of Japara glued together with Bostik. He and Gordon Brown found that the Roper was impossible to canoe. They decided to take a plane trip with 5 other men from Katherine, looking at the different rivers around the Katherine area. They flew over the Katherine Gorge, flew up the Mary River onto the floodplains and over the buffalo country. George Taylor had been a Spitfire pilot during the war, and he was their pilot on this trip. At times they thought that George might think he was still flying a Spitfire. We flew so low that mud from the buffaloes splattered on the front windscreen of the plane. We flew towards Darwin over the Adelaide River, and we had to refuel in Darwin before we could continue our journey in the afternoon. The total cost of the flight for the whole day was £70. We flew back along the Katherine, and it looked pretty good. Our next trip was up to the Katherine Gorge to test the canoe out and see that it was worthy enough to do a long trip. We canoed up approximately 5 gorges, and the canoe was excellent. We began preparations for the trip down to the Daly crossing. Gordon Brown was a fireman in the North Australian Railways. Of course, there were steam trains in those days. Peter Dunham was a postal officer at the post office. So they arranged their leave. All they were allowed, of course, in those days, because of the shortage of staff, was 1 week. So they knew they had to complete the journey in 8 days. They left the low level, Katherine low level, in July 1953. A little bit late in the year because the water levels were quite low. They had difficulty in the early stages and had to portage quite often. They passed Springvale Station, and at that time Tom Ronan, the author, and his family were living there. Tom, of course, supplemented his income by running a goat milk farm. The upper sections of the Katherine River were extremely beautiful, with small, narrow runs, beautiful couch banks, and plenty of rapids. The river fell quite a lot in these early stages, and the two men had to be careful that they didn't rupture the plastic skin of the folding boat. They were up at daylight and on the river every day, and most days didn't come off the river till about an hour before dark. They knew they had to make good time. The overall length of their journey was 230 miles. Below the King Junction, they came upon Limestone Creek, dry at that time of the year, but then they headed to the junction of the Flora. Flora and the Katherine start the Daly River. This was a magnificent sight. The Flora falls in and tumbles into the junction with numerous rapids and falls, and most of the sand was made up of small marine animal shells. They walked approximately 1 mile upstream to the first major fall. This tumbled into the river about 20 foot high. The river is only 20 miles long and starts where the Matheson Creek and the Flora join, and the water pours out of huge springs at this junction. And in 20 Mile there are 5 major falls and 9 sets of very strong rapids. Leaving the Flora, They headed downstream and they came across Bill Alexander's peanut farm. Bill was the only man they saw on the journey. He had a huge acreage under crop, but unfortunately for Bill, he lost the market in Perth through the introduction of South African nuts, and the Queensland farmers, of course, wouldn't let him in there. He eventually walked off. The section from Dorisvale to Ulu Crossing was probably the most spectacular. Beautiful, clear water, lovely rapids, big deep holes, and excellent camping on the banks. Gordon and Peter caught enough fish to eat, and they also shot enough ducks to vary the diet. They had a magnificent time. Getting down towards the Daly, they thought it prudent to camp on the second Anna bank, away from the edge of the water, because they had begun to see several large saltwater crocodiles. They were met at the crossing by their good friend Colin Townsend, who had driven up from Katherine to pick them up. 8 days of great adventure. Their journey back to Katherine was in an American Bantam car and pulling a trailer to carry the gear. This was owned by Peter Dunham, and it didn't go too fast on the highways, but it could almost climb a brick wall. A great bush vehicle, bearing in mind that there were no bitumen roads in those days, and the track into the Daly was something to be seen. Plans for the second Katherine Daly trip began immediately, but it took 5 years before the second trip eventuated. In the interim, Peter Dunham and Cole Townsend built 2 Canadian canoes. These were tested around the low level of Katherine by several people, friends of Peter Dunham and Cole Townsend, and they passed with flying colours. The kits had been bought from Sydney, been freighted up by steamer and picked up in Darwin and brought down to Katherine. Flip Phelps was one of the fellows that tried the canoes out, and we caught several barramundi above the low level. The 4 men doing the trip were all Katherine men, young men, loving the bush and full of adventure. Ken Boyle was a motor mechanic working for the Department of Works. Val King was a lineman working for the Electricity Department. Joe Rowbottom worked for the Department of Works as well. Peter Dunham, of course, was a postal officer. They attempted to go up the Flora again and managed to get about halfway. There's some beautiful falls, but there were quite a few major obstacles. A later trip, they did finally make the top of the Flora Junction. Again, there was plenty of food to be caught, barramundi, ducks, an abundance of wild game, crocodiles, pigs. Val King was an excellent bushman, and he taught the other three many bush skills. The canoes took a battering. There was no portaging done, shot every rapid, and of course plenty of times when the canoes had to be patched in the evening. We had a leisurely trip, 3 weeks in all, so some days were spent just on one section, either swimming or fishing or canoeing the rapids. There were some beautiful glens and glades and beautiful fresh water. Several small pigs ended up in the Baduri to supplement the larder. And we had some high adventure with some of the old boars that we came across. Nearing the Daly, we saved the last fish so that we could take it home with us. Ray Felgate was there to pick us up to take us home.